Hey everybody, welcome back to another video. Today I wanted to discuss a very interesting topic that I get a load of questions about. A lot of people send me questions about the topic of how does the Line 6 Helix or even other modelers, how do they quote unquote feel? Now there's been a lot of discussion about this. Other people have done videos about this. I'm going to take this from a slightly different standpoint and talk a little bit about this whole idea of feel when we're playing a modeler, and to some degree when we're playing a real guitar amp. Now the first thing that I want to do though is define what I mean by feel, because I find a lot of discussions tend to become circular discussions and kind of lead nowhere, because we oftentimes have two people discussing something that are talking about completely different things and kind of arguing completely different points. So the idea of feel, let's talk about it in relation to a modeler versus a real guitar amp. I did a video last week about which guitar modeler is the best, where I discussed a lot of the reasons why so many folks can't really come to any decisive conclusions because they don't test things the right way and they don't do proper comparisons. So along that line, I hear a lot of folks say, I want to make my Helix or modeler feel more like a real guitar amp. You go, okay, well that's fine, but let's compare something for a second. If we're in a room with a real guitar amp plugged into a 4x12 cab cranked up and we play, that's definitely going to be a certain sound and feel. Then if we go plug a modeler into a set of headphones or 5-inch studio monitors and play and go, wow, this just doesn't feel the same. Well, of course it doesn't feel the same, because we're actually not comparing apples to apples. We're comparing apples to oranges here, and it's going to have a dramatically different feel. So I don't usually think of feel in those terms. And let me describe to you my opinion on what feel is. Others may disagree, and that's fine, but I just have to sort of set down what I'm talking about before I go into this video and talk about how we can change the feel, possibly for the better, of the Line 6 Helix. So one important point is that I've played through many different styles of real guitar amps. Every one of them had a different feel to me. They responded different to the way that I played, the way that I attacked the strings, the sort of input stimulus that I gave that guitar amp. So to even say that every single real guitar amp feels the same, in my opinion, kind of doesn't even add up. So it's not really fair to say, well, this modeler doesn't feel like a real amp, when every amp kind of feels a little different, if that makes sense. And I hope that's an interesting point. So here's what I really think of when I think of feel. I think of how the amp model, whether real or whether a modeled Helix amp model or from other modelers, is how they respond to what I mentioned before, the input stimulus I put into them. If I pick hard, it's going to respond a certain way. If I pick softly, it's going to respond a different way. Maybe it will distort more. Maybe the dynamics change. All of these things describe what we refer to as a non-linear response to the input. So if I pick soft and it cleans up versus if I pick hard and it distorts more, that's a non-linear response. The response of that amp is going to be different depending on the input stimulus that I put into it. So that allows me, with my very hands, to be able to control how this amp sounds. To me, that equates more to feel than just something such as, let's say, changing the overall EQ of an amp. I've heard some people imply that the feel of an amp changes, let's say, if we add high cuts and low cuts to it. Now, I mean, there is a certain truth to that we could fool ourselves into thinking that it feels different. But let's say we put a high and low cut after an amplifier and its speaker cabinet. Well, that's not changing the input or the amplifier speaker's nonlinear response. It's just simply doing a static EQ change. It's going to sound different, and I mean, I guess by extension, if that changes the way we play, then that's a good thing, and it will sort of adjust the feel, maybe in how we play. But that's not what I'm really referring to here. I'm referring more to the control that we have with our hands and how responsive it is to, like I said before, the input stimulus we put into it, if that makes sense. Let me give you an example to just sort of clarify what I'm talking about here in regards to an amplifier. So here we are over at HX Adit. I'm plugged direct into my Helix. It's going through just one path with nothing on it. And this is the sound we get of the direct guitar. What what I mean by reacting to the input stimulus. You'll notice that with this, whether I hit quietly or harder and more volume, there's no difference in the reaction. The sound doesn't compress different. It doesn't distort more. This is a very linear response. It doesn't matter how I hit it, it's just going to sound the same way. So there's really no feel to this, let's say, or it has its own feel, which is just very static and bland. Now that's going to react very different if I'm using a guitar amp. If I now come over to something like this, which is using the Matchstick Channel 2 amp, you can hear very clearly that if I play with the pads of my fingers, the amp responds a certain way. If I dig in with the pick, it responds with more bite, and there's non-linear characteristics to it. If I play softly with the pick, if I roll my guitar volume down, guitar volume down, cleans up, guitar volume up. So there's different input stimulus being put into this amp, and it's reacting different versus when there was no amp on it. I don't think that's a surprise to anybody, but that's just to illustrate the difference between linear and non-linear. So when I talk about feel, I talk about things, in my opinion, for my purpose, things that I can control with the stimulus of my hands and the way I play. And therefore, that's going to translate to me that is a different feel to that amplifier. So that's where I'm going to take this discussion from that standpoint. So let's talk about 3 ways that we can change, for the better, maybe for the worse, of the Line 6 Helix. So let's talk about the first way we can really adjust the feel of the amp model that we're playing. And I'm going to talk about 2 parameters, sag and bias. I'm not going to get into great detail about what they're actually doing, simply because I did a video about this about 3 years ago, roughly. And I went into great detail about those parameters. I'll put the link below if you're interested in kind of diving in more to those. But what I have done with sag here is I've set up 3 snapshots. Snapshot 1 is with sag on 5. Snapshot 2 has us going with sag up to 10. And snapshot 3 has us going with sag down to 0, and nothing else is snapshot enabled. I have the impedance setting on auto. So let's start off with snapshot 1 where the sag is on 5, and we'll listen kind of to what the sag does in that it affects the dynamics of the amp, and the low end especially kind of how it squashes, almost compressor-like. Now we'll go up to the sag on 10. Back to 1. Trying to get the volumes fairly close here. The sag on 10 might be a little louder. Now let's go to sag on 0. I hope that's coming through on YouTube. It's a very big feel difference in under the fingers, and it reacts very differently to the way that we play. The volumes might not be matched perfectly, but I hope that comes across and you get the impression. Now, so how could we use this? Well, if we were to go to something like, let's say, snapshot 4 here, let's say the normal setting is around 5. And we wanted just a little more squish out of that. We could always bump that up just a little bit. Or the alternative. Can really dramatically change the way this amp feels in response to what our hands are doing and how we're playing. So very interesting stuff. I hope that kind of is something that some folks will maybe look into and play with when they maybe feel like, this amp isn't feeling right. Then they can adjust it in that way. One thing to keep in mind, the bias and the sag controls work interactively with the master control. With lower master settings, these parameters aren't going to be as noticeable when we change them. With the master on 10, we are going to hear more of an effect with these controls. So on to bias now. Let's take a listen again how this sounds. We know what it sounds like here at 5 with the sag back on 5. Let's move that down to 0. What I'm going to do too is crank up the gain a little bit here. You'll notice when I go down with my bias down to 0, my pick attack makes less of a difference on how much overdrive we have. If I go up to 10 with that, also listen to the distortion quality. It's kind of a little bit more of a pleasant sound up with the bias on 10 and a little more responsive. Hugely different feel to it. I don't have as much control with the bias down on 0. So the other thing is, I had the gain fairly low when I was doing the sag test. Let's see what the sag does now with more gain. The amp now has a tighter feel. It's squishier there. I hope you can see now from those little demonstrations, we can dramatically change the feel of an amp model by small moves on the sag and bias control. So go do your own experiments where you set them to extremes and hear how they work with particular amp models you like. And then once you understand that, when you come across a problem where maybe you're not getting the feel you want, you'll know how to maybe adjust the sag and bias to get you closer in that ballpark to what you want. All right, number 2 is a trick that I'm known for on my channel from a video I did, the very first Helix video I did over 3 years ago. And that is putting an LA Studio comp at the end of my chain after everything, reverb, delays, and everything. I know a lot of folks say, oh, you shouldn't do that. I've talked about that a million times. I'm not gonna get into that here. But I wanna show you, a lot of folks might say, oh, I already know you do that and I've tried it. But I'm gonna give you another little interesting trick with it today. But this definitely, again, reacts to how we play and changes the feel of the preset we're using, but it just gives to me a nice squish that acts as a mastering compressor to kind of just glue everything together and therefore changing the feel because it's going to respond different based off of how I hit the strings because it's a non-linear response. So first things first with this, I'd want to play it and see if I'm actually getting any gain reduction on my gain reduction. So right now it's set to have about half a dB of gain reduction. I'm going to bring my gain down here on this. I want these to be sort of close to unity gain so that if I turn it on and off, you can hear the difference between the compression and not just the sound getting louder. Okay, so there, here's the preset without that compressor. With it. When I dig in now, I feel that compressor just clamp down a little bit. So that's one of my favorite things, but let me give you a different way to work. There is a thing called New York style compression. And this was kind of made famous by some engineers in, you guessed it, New York. And it's where they would do more of a parallel style compression. And there's a lot of schools of thought on how to do this. Some folks would add EQ to it. Some would just set it up in different ways. But what one of the things was to actually set the compressor very aggressively. So something like this where we would take the peak reduction, just crank it up. Where it was just adding tons of compression to the sound. Now maybe some folks would like that, but I would probably say, and even maybe setting it to the limiter setting. Then taking that and taking it right out with our mix control. And just blending in as much of it as we want of that kind of really squashed sound. I hope that's coming across too. That's a really neat trick. So we just really crank that compressor to get as much compression out as we can, and then just use the mix control to blend in how much or how little we want from it. For my third little trick, we're going to take this same preset. Now we're going to talk about the impedance setting. Now we have an auto impedance setting. I'm not going to go into detail about this. I've talked about this a lot on my channel before, but the sort of standard setting for most guitar interfaces is going to be 1 mega ohm. We can actually have quite an effect on the sound of, and to some degree, the feel of the amp. Now this is, I'm not going to say this one is quite as extreme as the other examples I've given, but what we'll notice is as we move down with this controller, we've lost some high end, and the amount of, let me crank the gain up a little more, because what you'll notice is we'll lose some gain as well. There'll be a little bit more distortion here. Now this is actually changing the way that our kind of pickups behave and are loaded down. So it's also likely going to have some effect on the nonlinear characteristics of the amplifier itself. I don't find that is as much as the sag and the bias will have, or even the compressor, because we can really adjust those settings. But if we take something like this at 1 mega ohm, it is going to change the feel somewhat. Now, somebody might say, well, that got really dark. Yeah, it did. So what happens if we came back in over here and maybe slapped in something like a low and high shelf EQ and just kind of took my normal setting here somewhere, even if we set it at, let's say, 1000 hertz, and just started rolling some of that high end back in. So let's do this little comparison. So what I've done is I've set up Snapshot 5 to not have the shelf EQ in and to have the input impedance at 1 mega ohm and all the same settings on the amp. And then for Snapshot 6, I had the input impedance changed to 10 kilo ohms and engaged this high shelf EQ at 1 kilohertz plus 9 dB. And I lowered the level by 3 dB just to get the volumes more matched. So here's what we do. We start off with the 1 mega ohm setting. Then when we switch to Snapshot 6, we go to the 10 kilo ohm setting with the high shelf. Back and forth. Give this maybe just a touch more volume. Kind of neat because on the 1 mega ohm setting, the amp seems to jump into overdrive a little easier. And the characteristics of the distortion kind of change a little bit. Now, I don't find that that one is as abrupt, but I find a lot of folks end up pulling it back and go, oh, it just got dark. But yeah, we can add some of that darkness back in with something like a shelf EQ or EQ, and then compare how we think that the amp feels. You'll have to try that yourself and see if that's something that makes the feel different for yourself. I notice it a little bit here. We gotta be careful because it is easy to be fooled by EQ changes and think that something that is sounding different is also because of some nonlinear change instead of just a static EQ change. But because the impedance is happening into the amp, it only makes sense that it will somehow play with the nonlinear characteristics of the amp, or so I would think. Could be wrong, but it sort of seems that way. So what did you guys think? I hope that was a clear discussion on first of all, what I kind of think about what feel is and giving kind of my definition. I don't think I'm right or wrong. It's how I view it. Others might view it different, and that's fine. It's really not something that we should argue about, but rather just work towards different techniques like this to attain common goal, to sort of attain an outcome that's gonna work for all of us and give us lots of options. If we're playing an amp model and we're going, I don't know, I'm just not really digging the way this feels, maybe we can look into things like sag and bias, and understanding what those controls do at their extremes will allow us to make small changes that may be just what we need to take our preset over the top. Adding that EQ at the end can be a huge thing. It allows us to dial in how much or how little of it we want. And then using something like the parallel New York style compression that I was talking about can be a very powerful tool. And we can just use a very small amount and kind of get that nice non-linear kind of control in our hands again. And then obviously the impedance control is something we can play around with or without EQ, and we can use snapshots to engage it, disengage it, and however we want. So I hope that was a useful discussion on feel. I thought it was a good video to do because I think it was a bit of a different take on a lot of the other videos that have been done about, the feel and sort of making the Helix feel like a real amp. I'm not even gonna go there because like I said before, I truly believe all different real amps feel different. So what exactly are we chasing? And then we have to monitor them through the same system. Something I talked about in my video last week was also, if we're really going to compare a guitar amp in a room raging through a speaker cabinet, well then the only way to compare a modeler to that would be to have that modeler through a power amp, through that same speaker cab in the same room, matched at the same volume. Then we'll start maybe getting to the bottom of which, feels better. But a lot of folks may or may not do the experiments or the comparisons correct and come away with kind of a skewed opinion because they compared things in an incorrect manner. So that's an important point, I think, too. Anyways, thank you guys so much for tuning in. I hope that wasn't too long and drawn out. Thanks for your time. Please like the video, share it with anybody who you think would enjoy it, and please hit the subscribe button and the little bell notification to get notified when I put new content out. I will be back really soon with some more content. Again, thanks so much for your time, guys. Ciao for now.